Guy Ron Gilboa is a lecturer at the Department of Arabic of the Bar-Ilan University. He studies medieval Arabic adab and popular literature and is especially interested in ajaib. His most recent article, titled Marvels and Morals, Narrative Structure and Didactic Principles, Ajaib al-Hind, in the Ajaib al-Hind, was published last month in Le Museum. Oded Zinger teaches at the Department of Jewish History of the Hebrew University. His research explores the intersection of law and gender in documents of the Cairo Geniza. His first book, Living with the Law, Gender and Community Among the Jews of Medieval Egypt, is scheduled to be published in March 2023 by Penn State University Press. Guy and Oded's paper is titled, Listen to a Boast That Will Leave the Heart Dazed, Jewishness and Arabness in a Fakhr poem from the Cairo Geniza. Please.
Okay, hello everybody. Thank you for the introduction and thank you for inviting us. I should say that although my work is on gender and law, and the book is coming out in Penn University Press, not Penn State, but we're not going to speak anything about gender and law. We're going to talk about something completely different. We know that this is a difficult hour of the day, so our solution is listen to a boast that will leave your heart dazed or at least awake. So what we will be talking about today is a very large Judeo-Arabic poem of great interest that we stumbled upon. Because of the size and its difficulty, we will not say everything that there is to say, but we do hope to give you a taste of this interesting text and the questions it raises. The full text and the translation is found in the sort of conference folders, and you can look at the full text there. And the structure of our talk today, I will be introducing Samawal, and then we'll talk about the 1905 discovery of the Geniza poem and our discovery. Then Guy will sort of lead us through the poem and a few select case studies from the big poem. And then we'll do the discussion. And I don't think we'll have time to the modern afterlife of Samawal, but we can always hope. So let us begin. So, at the crucible of the entangled relationships between Jews and Arabs, Judaism and Islam stands Samawal ibn Adiyah. Samawal is said to have been an Arab warrior poet in the middle of the 6th century. The Arabic literary tradition generally remembers Samawal as Jewish, Yahudi, and as residing in a fort called Ablaq in the Hijazi town of Taima. It is a site that has indeed long ancient Jewish roots. His legendary status stands on two pillars. The first is a well-known legend in which the great warrior Prince Imru al-Qais, which we heard about today, entrusted Samawal with his arms and armor, and later when the leader of the Ghassanids, the enemy of Imru al-Qais, came to Samawal's fort demanding these items, Samawal allowed his own son to be killed before his eyes rather than betray Imru al-Qais' trust. For this, he became a paragon of fidelity, as the expression "Awfa min as-Samawal," more faithful than Samawal, was coined. The second pillar of his fame is his Lamia, a short qasida of boasting, a fakhr poem. The poem defends the poet's clan from verbal attack by a certain female poet, saying, "Indeed, we are few in number, but we are noble and do not shy away from battle." The poem is very famous, and I'm sure there are quite a few in the audience who can recite it by heart. Yesterday, Professor Barasher told me that he likes this poem a lot, and we will return to this poem anon. So all this is very well known, but in 1905, a startling discovery was made. Hartwig Hirschfeld discovered in the Cairo Geniza collection of Cambridge a single leaf, that is 2 pages, and it's here before you, of an Arabic poem in Hebrew letters that designate itself as Hadi Kasida li Samawal. Hirschfeld recognized the serious problems with this attribution. For example, the poem contains terminology known from the Quran, like referring to Abraham as Khalil, but still he tried in all sorts of ways to defend the attribution in various grounds. Hirschfeld's discovery garnered much attention and soon became some of the greatest Orientalists of the day, including Margoliouth, Nöldeke, Krachkovsky, and Hirschberg. Here I put just the 2 most important ones for our story, Margoliouth and Hirschberg. chipped in with their opinion about the poem's authenticity and identity of Samawal. Now, we're not going to go into the various arguments and positions about whether it is really a poem by Samawal, the famous Samawal. First, because we want to concentrate on our own discovery, and rather than rehash all debates. Second, the debate about the authenticity of the poem can be put to rest. The poem is clearly medieval, rather than pre-Islamic, and the attribution to Samawal is pseudo-epigraphical. The question that interests us is not whether the poem is a forgery, or the attribution is a forgery, but what does such a forgery achieves? What does a poem in the ascription of, to Samawal do? Why is it attributed to Samawal, and what does the poem achieves? So, but there is one part of the debate surrounding the poem that needs to be mentioned. After the fragment was discovered in the Geniza, Louis Sheikho published the poem in Arabic letters in the Arabic Journal of Al-Mashriq and urged the readers to report if they know of other versions of the poem. And soon enough, in the next issue, Sheikho printed new version of the text sent to him by the Syriac Archbishop of Mosul. The last line in the version mentions our Messiah, so thus baptizing the Samawal of our poem as a Christian, which is of course what Sheikho did in his research. In the following issue, Sheikho printed a third version of the poem that Anastas el-Karmeli, over there, a Lebanese priest and Arab linguist, has found in Baghdad, ostensibly from a manuscript written in 1816. This version attributes the poet to a Jewish poet, so it admits that the poem is Jewish, but a Jewish poet named Samawal, but not Samawal ibn Adiyah, but the composer of the famous Lamia, but Samawal from the tribe of Qurayza. Now, there is much to be said about the two Christian versions. Basically, there are good grounds to argue that they have never existed. But due to consideration of time, we will not go into this. We can talk about it in the question period. So this finally brings us to our sort of discovery. Using a digital tool that suggests possible links between Geniza fragments developed by the Friedmann Project for Geniza Research, we've been able to identify the continuation of the poem. So we believe that this manuscript that we discovered not only belongs from the codex that the original page that Hirschfeld discovered, but it's actually the exact continuation of 4 leaves. So now we have 8 pages. So now, we added 8 pages. So now we have 10 pages of this long poem. It's from the David Kaufman Geniza collection in Budapest. And these leaves were completely unmentioned. So there's no information about these 4 leaves. And the discovery brings the total number of verses in the poem to 115. So a very long poem, making it longer than all of Samawal's surviving diwan put together. Now, even now, the poem remains incomplete. So even though we have 10 pages of the poem, it is still incomplete. But we do feel that towards the end, the poem reached a certain coda, like the final sort of moments of a Beethoven's symphony. You know that it's about to end. And we think that there may have been one leaf missing, but probably not full. Just a few lines are probably missing, but we don't know. In addition to our discovery, another bifolium of the poem from another codex was discovered by the ERC-funded project, Arabic Poetry in the Cairo Geniza, led by Dr. Muhammad Ahmed of the University of Dublin, and we are very grateful for them for sharing with us, generously this information. So these 4 pages of the poem do not add a lot of new text. They fill in a few holes, but they do provide different readings of some passages which are occasionally better. While the text of this bifolium is very close to the poem, the full version of the larger manuscript, it very often shuffles the lines of the poem, suggesting that the poem circulated in a rather fluid structure, like we know from a lot of Arabic poetry, where lines can change from one version to another. And the fact that a couple of the manuscripts exist suggests a broader circulation of the poem. Okay, so the fact that we have at least 2 versions of the poem suggests that there was that the poem was circulating not just in that one document that we found, and this agrees with the fact that some of the mistakes in the manuscript reveal that it was copied, that the copy in our hand was copied from earlier manuscripts. Some of these manuscripts are probably in Hebrew. So, for example, Ikhtaram Ukman Awakira, which is written with a dalet. It's not extremely clear, but when you look at it, it's pretty clear that this dalid is like this dalid and not like this reish. And there are many other examples. And there are some scribal errors caused from copying from Arabic script manuscript. So wayulhimu waswasan, waswasan, wayulabisu, and it's written wayalis or wayalzim, but we are pretty sure that it's wayalbis, and it's a mistake that can only happen from copying from Arabic script and not from Hebrew script. So the poem probably circulated both in Hebrew letters and in Arabic script. So expanding the known text 4 times is a good occasion to reconsider Samawal's Fakhar. And I now turn the stage to my esteemed colleague.
Thank you very much, Oded. And again, I would like to thank the organizers, to Yohanan and Ella in particular, for inviting us to present our ongoing research. I took upon myself the noble mission of presenting the poem, and that's what I'm going to do. So as Oded said, our version of the poem consists of at least 115 verses. The meter of the poem, and I must say we haven't scanned it all yet, but the meter of the poem is mixed, as already noted by Margolioth. Some of the verses are in a tawil, others in al-kamel, and others do not scan. So not exactly a classical poem. The text exhibits several divergences from classical Arabic grammar, for example, and we'll see it shortly, mixing feminine and masculine pronouns, using ungrammatical forms such as laistu for classical lastu. However, there was an attempt to adhere to classical register, as evinced by the poet's usage of rare and poetic lexicon. The genre of the poem is made clear from the outset. So we have وأحصي مناقب قدمة اختارهم رحمنهم بشواهد ودلائل أنصت لفخر, etc. I count the feats of the ancients whom their merciful one, Rahmanuhum, chose with proofs and signs. Listen to a boast, fakhr, that will render the heart bemused. We chose a different translation here. And ignite fire inside the bosom. As is made clear from the outset, the poem is all about fakhr, boast or self-vaunting, the subject matter of which is the virtues and feats of the forefathers. As such, it echoes the mood of the early tribal fakhr poetry in which the poet extols the virtues of his group and sets himself explicitly or otherwise against his adversaries and or those of his tribe. Ostensibly, the poem diverges from the conventions of the classical Arabic polythematic ode, as we've heard about it earlier today from Iyas, in that it jumps straight away into the qasd, the poem's aim or object, that is fakhr. Unlike, again, the idealized Jahili qasida, which begins with conventional amatory opening, the nasib, followed by a description of a journey, of a desert journey, rahil, or an ekphrastic wasf episode, and ending with a so-called qasd. So, however, in this and in other aspects, it echoes a far better known fakhr poem attributed to a Samawal, namely his Lamia. The common traits go beyond the genre. Like the famous Lamia, our poem also rhymes with lam. Similarly, both are composed, at least in part, in the tawil, and both turn to an unnamed adversary who had presumably found fault with the poet's people. In Samawal's Lamia, the adversary is a woman. So in Samawal ibn Adiyah's Lamia, we have تعيرنا أن قليل عديدنا فقلت لها إن الكرام قليل. It's Arbery's translation. She was reproaching us that we are few in numbers. So I said to her, indeed, noble men are few. And in our poem, we have again, ala ayyuha sifru, allati, and note the mixing of the pronouns, allati aba sadati, isma jawabi, laistu anka bighafili, oh, you good for nothing. It's a provisional translation. Who has found fault with my people's chieftains, sadati, listen to my reply, I shall not ignore you. And furthermore, both poems make the claim that the poet's people are the choicest. So in Samawa ibn Adiya's Lamia, it's lines 12 and 13. صفونا فلم نقدر وأخلص سيرنا إناث أطابت حملنا وفحول علونا إلى خير ظهور وحطنا لوقت إلى خير البطون نزول. We have remained pure and unsullied, and females and stallions who bore us in goodly fame kept intact our stock. We climbed on the best of the backs, and a descending brought us down in due time to the best of bellies. And again in our poem, وَأُحْصِي مَنَاكِبَ قَدَامَةٍ اخْتَرَهُمْ رَحْمَنُهُمْ بِشَوَائِدَ وَدَلَائِلِ, I count the feats, etc. These correspondences are likely intentional. Like the attribution in the manuscript to a Samawal, the poet deliberately invokes, through his structuring of the poem, the famous Lamia, and through it, the legendary figure of its supposed author. We have here a sort of pseudo-epigraphic masquerade. The author of this new poem uses an array of intertextual gestures which are meant to give the audience the impression that he is none other than Samawa ibn Adiyah himself. However, unlike the famous Lamia, which does not so much as hint at its poet's supposed Jewish identity, our own poem revolves all around it. A short review of the poem's contents will reveal how much so. So it begins with addressing the adversary, then recounting the feats of the ancients, the patriarchs, David, Solomon, Jonah, Elisha, Ezekiel, then some passages about Jerusalem, some stanzas about Jerusalem, verses, Daniel in the lion's den, eschatological matters, defending the Torah and those who keep it, the wickedness of the sinners, and ends with a coda, a final address to the adversary. Sorry. The ordering of the materials handled in the poem is not entirely chronological. For example, Joseph is discussed after Moses and the Exodus and before David. However, there is a detectable chronological framework as the poem begins with the patriarchs and ends with matters of eschatology. Significantly, there is no mention in the poem, and this is very important, there is no mention in the poem of any post-biblical event. And moreover, all the figures and events mentioned in it would be well known to both Jewish and Muslim audiences. So, because the poem is too long to read and commented on in full, we have chosen to present the following examples. So, sorry, I haven't written, so I'll say it aloud. We'll examine 2 verses on the patriarchs, some verses on Jerusalem, and a verse on the Sabbath. So let us begin. The patriarchs. The patriarchs play a main role in presenting Jewish history through a tribal boast, through fakhr. The poet claims that God chose the patriarchs, barren and sterile, to keep their dynasty as pure as possible. اختارهم عقما عواقر للذي اختصهم ربي للصفو تناسلي. He chose them barren and sterile for the purity of lineage with which my Lord privileged them. Now, the use of the word safl, lisafwi tanasuli, harks back to the use of the same root in Samawal's Lamia and expresses a similar idea, right? Safauna falam nakdur, etc. Though we are few, our pedigree is pure and without blemish. As opposed to the Lamia, here the poet stresses that it was God who kept it pure, using the famous biblical stories, or referring to the famous biblical stories about the barrenness of the patriarchs and the matriarchs. The first patriarch mentioned is, of course, Abraham, as one would expect. فهذا خليل صير النار حوله ريحين جنات الغصون ذوابل, or سيرة. But I think it's better to read in the active voice. Look at this friend of God, Khalil, the fire around whom he, that is God, turned into fragrant plants in gardens of slender boughs. Conspicuously, here and elsewhere in the poem, the poet uses Quranic epithets in mentioning the patriarchs. And here we can see that Abraham's name isn't mentioned, but rather the Quranic epithet known to all of us, Khalil, the friend of God. The poet alludes to the story of Abraham in Nimrod's furnace, known from both Jewish Haggadah and the Quran, and you have the verse here. Surah 21, etc. The line refers to Abraham's miraculous deliverance from the furnace, from the fire, stating that its flames turned into a fragrant garden. This detail is known from Islamic sources, as you can see in the slide. So here we quote Athalabi's tafsir, where he quotes on the authority of a Suddi, قال السودي فأخذت الملائكة بدبعاء إبراهيم عليه السلام فأقعدوه على الأرض فإذا عين ماء عذب وورد أحمر ونرجس. So we know this detail from Islamic legend, and also it makes an appearance in later Judeo-Arabic and Hebrew sources, probably drawing on the Arabic. The next patriarch is called Dhabih, offering, sacrificial offering, a designation of the son sacrificed by Abraham. فهذا ذبيح فداه بكبشه برأه بديئا or بديئا لا نتاج الثياتل. Here is a sacrificial offering, Dhabih, whom he, God, ransomed with his ram. He created it ex nihilo, he created it anew, not born of ewes, literally theatilis ibexes. So in Quranic exegesis, as we know, the identity of the said son, of the sacrificed son, is debated. In our poem, it clearly refers to Isaac and not to Ishmael. However, the poem does not state that explicitly, and moreover, it echoes the Quranic formulation, وَفَدَيْنَاهُ بِذَبْحٍ عَظِيمٍ, in stating هَذَا ذَبِيحٌ فَدَاهُ بِكَبْشِهِ. The second part of the verse adds the peculiar detail that the ram was created ex nihilo, and that it was not conceived naturally. بَرَأَهُ بَدِيًا لَا نِتَاجَ الثَّيَاتِلِ. This detail is known from the Mishnah. In Tractate Avot, it is mentioned that the ram is mentioned among the miraculous things created by Nashmashot, that is on the eve of the first Sabbath, right? 10 דברים נבראו בערב שבת בין השמשות, ואילו של אברהם אבינו. 10 things were created on the eve of the Sabbath at twilight, and these are they. And the ram, and one of them is the ram of Abraham, our father. Sorry. It is also attested in Quranic exegesis. So again, we can look at Thalabi, who quotes on the authority of the early mystic Abu Bakr al-Warraq that the ram was indeed a great sacrifice, since it was not born but rather created anew. لأنه لم يكن عن نسل وإنما كان بتكوين. We move on to Jerusalem. Jerusalem is mentioned several times in the poem. Here we only quote the most conspicuous passage discussing the city. So I'll read through it quickly. أليس لنا البيت المقدس قبلة هي القبلة العظمى لبر وعادل أليس إليها المرسلين بأسرهم لمرسلهم صلوا بصدق تراسل. So note that it's المرسلين and not المرسلون, of course, right? أليس بها قد علقت الحكمة مسلسلة كانت خلاف السلاسل نصبها إله الحق للحكم تطول وتقصر بين حاق وباطل. Is not the temple, Bayt al-Muqaddas, Jerusalem, our qibla, the greatest qibla for the wretched and the just? Is it not to it that all the messengers prayed to their sender in the truthful succession? Was not wisdom hung as a chain in it, unlike any other chain? The God of justice set it to judge, lengthening and shortening according to truth or lie. So Jerusalem is dubbed in the poem both as Al-Bayt al-Muqaddas and as the greatest Qibla, Al-Qibla al-Uzma. This is clearly a polemical stance which capitalizes on Jerusalem being the first Qibla in Islam, to claim it as the greatest Qibla. After all, it was, as the poem says, towards Jerusalem that all prophets and messengers directed their prayers. Another miracle found in Jerusalem was the wondrous chain that, according to legend, extended and shortened to distinguish between truthful and false testimonies. right? تطول وتقصر بين حق وباطل. This, we think, refers to the famous Qubat al-Silsila erected by the Umayyad Caliph Abd al-Malik ibn Marwan in 691 in Al-Haram al-Sharif. Islamic traditions attribute this ordeal to the time of King David and describe how the chain was held by litigants while taking oath in front of the king. And you can find references to it in Al-Wasati's Fadail al-Bayt al-Muqaddas. It is this association with King David which legitimizes the allusion to this chain and facilitates its inclusion within our poem. Sorry. Our next example is probably our most striking example. It relates to the Sabbath. So line 94 of the poem alludes to a peculiar story concerning the Sabbath. It goes like this. أليس عُثِروا في السبت قوم فشوهوا وصاروا نكالا عبرة للمسائل. And I see Livnat is smiling for good reason. Did not a group of people stumble on the Sabbath and were disfigured and became an exemplary punishment as a moral for the one who questions? This peculiar line refers to a story that occurs several times in the Quran about a group of the Banu Israel who sinned by fishing on the Sabbath and, as a punishment, were transformed by God into apes, qirada. And here you have the most famous reference to it in Surah Al-A'raf. So, before going into it, I must mention, though the Quranic tale may have had midrashic background, as shown by the late Uri Rubin, the poem clearly alludes to the Quranic tale and to the Quranic text, and not to the Jewish proof texts adduced by Rubin. This can be seen by comparing the poetic line to the following Quranic verses. So this is from Surah Al-Baqarah, verses 65 to 66. وَلَقَدْ عَلِمْتُمُ الَّذِينَ اعْتَدَوْا مِنْكُمْ فِي السَّبْتِ فَقُلْنَا لَهُمْ كُونُوا قِرَادَةً خَاسِئِينَ فَجَعَلْنَاهَا نَكَالًا لِمَا بَيْنَ يَدَيْهَا وَمَا خَلْفَهَا وَمَوْعِظَةً لِلْمُتَقِينَ. And well you know, and this is Arbery's translation, of course, and well you know there were those among you that transgressed the Sabbath, and we said to them, be you apes, miserably slinking. And we made it a punishment exemplary for all the former times and for the latter, and an admonition to such as are God-fearing. Our line of poem is clearly a paraphrase of these two Quranic verses. Blue marks direct verbatim quotation, and green marks paraphrase. We have عُثِروا في السبت for وَاعْتَدَوْا في السبت, and we should note that Reish and Dalet can be easily mixed up in Judeo-Arabic, so عُثِروا might be here instead of وَاعْتَدَوْا, but later I will give another explanation. The term nakal, wasaru nakalan, the Quranic term nakal, exemplary punishment, is used in both the poem and the Quranic text, wasaru nakalan and faja'alnaha nakalan. Both the Quran and the poem mention that the punishment was a moral, ibra, or an admonition, maw'idha, to the God-fearing, lil mutaqin, or to the one who has questions, lil musail. At first glance, this allusion is peculiar to say the least. After all, the Quranic tale became a topos of anti-Jewish polemic. Why then would a poem of Jewish fakhr bring up such a tale? First, we would like to observe that the poem takes a softer tone towards the sinner than the Quran. As opposed to the Quran, the poem does not mention that the sinners were turned into apes, but that they were just deformed, shuwihu. Its use of the passive voice, عُثِروا, might be intentional after all, as it implies that the sinners were tripped or stumbled, and thus the sin was unintentional. And moreover, the poet stresses, as indeed is implied by the Quran itself, that the sinners were a group of people, قَوْمٌ, عُثِرُوا فِي السَّبْتِ قَوْمٌ, and not the entire nation. So, what actually happens here, or what we think happens here? Put simply, we think that our poem adapts the Quranic tale and reclaims it. The Quran instructs the reader to ask them, وَاسْأَلْهُمْ, to ask them, that is the Israelites, about the story of the sinners by the sea. Right, again, if you go back to Surah Al-A'raf, وَاسْأَلْهُمْ عَنِ الْقَرْيَةِ الَّتِي كَانَتْ حَضِيرَةَ الْبَحْرِ, etc. And our poet assumes the position of the one being asked. And his answer to the Quran is striking. Yes, we, the sons of Israel, know the story. However, it happened to just a group among us, and their actions, for which they were punished, were a mistake. Read in the context of the poem as a whole, the reclaiming of the Quranic tale is even more striking. At the hands of the poet, the entire affair turns from a shameful event to yet another example of God's special treatment of his chosen people. Since God punished those who transgressed as a sign and a warning, thus, the poet turns the cultural meaning of the story upside down. From a story commonly used for polemical and hostile purposes, a symbol of shame for the poet and his people, the story turns into a badge of honor of sorts, an emblem of God's special treatment of his people. And I spoke with Oded earlier. I don't think we know any other example of relating to this story in Jewish tradition. So if anyone knows, we'll be happy to hear about it. And Oded, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Guy, for doing the heavy lifting, which I would have been unable to do probably without making many mistakes. Okay, so I will conclude. So when we turn to look at the poem as a whole, we must first remember that this poem was discovered in the Geniza. Because the Geniza is essentially sacred trash, as the title of Hoffman in Cole's wonderful book, it often preserves texts that did not survive in the regular channels of transmission. So it allows us to see, the material in the Geniza, an unknown world of literary production beyond what is considered canonical, right? The fact that it ended up in the Geniza sort of preserved to us something that was not sort of handed down in generations. The historical study of literature should never be limited to the choice works of any age, but must look at the whole range of literary production. Thus, we think that rather than harping on the poem's failure to measure up to the strict standards of classical Arabic poetry, we can approach it for what it is and what it does, and not what it fails to be. So what is this poem? As we said, it's a poem of boasting, a fakhar, and what it boasts about is the Jewish lineage, tradition, and eschatological future. The addressee is never identified, but the repeated use of Islamic terminology suggests that the implied audience of the poem consists of both Jews and Arab Muslims. Notice that we are always saying Arab Muslims because the poem treats Islam and Arabness completely together. There's never a distinction between Arabness and Islam. So the boast can be read as an apologia. Jews under Islam were in an inferior submissive state, and the poem defends their tradition by going on the offensive and boasting that theirs is the best tradition and people. Now, asserting the merit of the Jewish tradition vis-a-vis Islamic Arab other is a tricky business. So the poem never actually degrades the opponent religion or tradition. Rather, it takes pride in the Jewishness by emphasizing only the heritage shared by Judaism and Islam. As mentioned before by Guy, the poem never mentions anything post-biblical or something unfamiliar from the writing from within the Islamic tradition. So relying on the biblical and Quranic correspondences allows the poem to assert the value of the Jewish tradition while making it palatable to Muslim ears. Now, in the process of seizing this common ground between Judaism and Islam for polemical ends, we think that the Jewish tradition itself is being transformed. By placing it within the mold of an Arab fakhar poem, the Jewish tradition is Arabized and tribalized and is saturated with Islamic elements and expressions. So the Judaism that sort of is boasted appears Arabized and Islamicized. Rather than think about this transformation as costs of polemics, we can think of it as generative aspects of polemics. Polemics actually produces a thing on the side that is sort of producing the polemics. Now, the use of the figure of Samawal is critical for this process. As the paragon of fidelity and the famous composer of the Lamia, Samawal holds substantial cultural capital. The fact that the Arab tradition remembers him as Jewish makes the idea of Samawal, rather than the historical Samawal about which we know nothing, into a wonderful axis, or if you want, an Archimedean point for this transformation. The very pride of the Arab tradition is its classical poetry. It's the very pride of the pride of Arab tradition, its classical poetry, is appropriated to demonstrate the superiority of the Jewish tradition. Now, taking pride in the Jewish tradition through Arabic poetry can be contrasted to the Sephardi Andalusian model that sought to assert Jewish cultural identity and literary competence through Hebrew poetry, right? You know, in Spain, you have poets saying, okay, the Arabs are proud of their literature, well, we can compose Hebrew poetry that looks, or that is even better. So this is a different model. And this, we think, opened up a whole issue about the role of Arabic poetry among the Jews. This is a more side comment. It used to be axiomatic that Jews wrote even religious literature in Arabic, but composed their poetry in Hebrew. Because this idea is so commonplace, a lot of the material in Arabic script in the Geniza was not examined. So, however, in recent years, this is changing, like the ERC project we mentioned, and we're discovering more and more poetry in Arabic in the Geniza. Poetry written by Jews, like our poem, and Muslim Arabic poetry that was obviously read and consumed by Jews, as evidenced by the fact that it actually reached the Geniza. Going back to Samawal, you know, as the axis of this Jewish-Islamic encounter in the poem, he himself is also transformed. The poem reclaims Samawal into the Jewish tradition, where he was previously unknown, and in the process refashions him as a Jew proud in his ancestors and fluent in the Jewish heritage, exactly what was missing in all the supposed pre-Islamic poems attributed to Samawal. So Samawal is Judaized and Judaism is Arabized. Now, the way this important figure in the Islamic tradition is Judaizes leaves us to the final point, which we find especially fascinating. It is common to start the history of Muslim-Jewish relations with the encounter between Muhammad and the Jews of Medina. It is often said that this encounter shaped Jewish-Muslim interaction in the following centuries. However, and this is striking, I think, if you look at medieval Jewish texts, the Arab chapter of the Jews is practically unknown. Except from one side reference in Maimonides' Igeret Ashmad, Jewish texts never refer, as far as I know, and I'm happy to be corrected, to the Jewish tribes of Arabia and the encounter with Muhammad. You know, I'm thinking also in Igeret Rav Shri Gaon, where Muhammad is mentioned, and immediately we are moved to Iraq, and the way Rav Yitzchak from Piruz Shavur is encountering Ali. So Muhammad comes, and we encounter the Muslims in Iraq, and the whole sort of chapter of Jewish presence in Arabia is just either unknown or ignored. So in reclaiming Samawal to the Jewish tradition, our poem also integrates the Arabian chapter of Jews to the cultural memory, and for example, the story about the Jews in the Shabbat who were punished in the Shabbat. So Jewish history in Arabia becomes part of Jewish horizon, and in the process, Judaism itself is Arabized. The poem is careful to reclaim this Jewish Arab past while declaring emphatically that we are not among the people of the Jāhiliyya in one of the last poems. So it's saying, you know, we are sort of reclaiming this sort of Jewish presence in Arabia. We're taking pride in it. It makes us, the choice of people. And yet, of course, there is the danger of being associated with the people of Jāhiliyya. So it says, La bi Jāhili. Okay, so the poem is long and rich, and with many more, in the material and allusions. After all, we've touched about a dozen lines out of more than 100. However, as our poet states towards what we think is the end, the coda of the poem, were I to speak all their glory, it would be as if I exhausted camels with heavy burden. But these lines, and also just our lecture, are myrrh, musk, frankincense, and ambergris scattered from the hems of some of the venerable. So thank you very much. And now the Inquisition can start.
Thank you very much for this interesting lecture. I have a suggestion maybe, if I may promote here the study of Judeo-Persian texts. We have several poems, several poets who do pretty much the same thing, meaning that during the pre-classical period, there's the 11th century, and even in the Mongol period, in the 14th century. So, for example, in a long elegy dedicated to one of the members of some unknown community somewhere in Afghanistan, you have 2 verses mentioned discussing wood and salih out of the blue. In the middle of all these biblical figures to which the deceased is compared. And another example would be Shahin, famous Judeo-Persian poet who lived in the 14th century, and he does this interesting play between polemics and the integration of Muslim tradition. For example, in his poem called the Rishit Nameh, a long poem in which he describes the narrative parts of Genesis, he all of a sudden brings this story in which Abraham goes to visit his son Ishmael in the desert, and he builds the Kaaba. So you can find this especially in an article written by Vera Bashmorin, which he calls Ishmaeliyat. And there are several other examples where these poems, some poems are adapted, the original poem, Muslim ones, are adapted into Judaism, and it's an interesting corpus that I think could be, you could compare it to.
No, we don't have a dating for this poem. The Geniza texts that survive look like classical Geniza, so 11th, 12th century, but that's just a guess. And we don't know when it was actually composed. It could have been composed earlier.
But thank you very much for the references, and it's a good case in point, and a very good. It would be interesting to compare the two things. I wonder if medieval Persian literature was not more open to this kind of literary experiments than medieval Arab literature, but we should discuss it. Thank you, Phil.
Guy, I think I remember that Miriam Frankel gave once a talk about the document which found in the Geniza that claims that Muhammad gave rights to Jews in Khaybar. Is this something similar? I mean, reclaiming the Jewish...
Yes, so we do have... my other example of such reclaiming the Arab past is that sort of story we have in a Geniza, again, a fabrication that is probably... we have evidence of such fabrications from the beginning of the 10th century, so before the Fatimids, in Iraq and then also in Egypt. And the Geniza preserved this kind of pseudo story where if the pact of Omar is given to Omar, well, we have a pact directly from Muhammad written down by Ali. Which of course, and then it says that we actually fought on the Shabbat for Muhammad, and therefore, in the same way that Futuh Misr attributed the great role to Mary, the wife of Muhammad who was Copt, then here Safiya, who is the Jewish wife of Muhammad, sort of because of her we are getting this great deal. And if you want, in the recent Etmol magazine, there is a little piece that I wrote exactly on this story.
So I have some questions and some kind of tentative comments, ideas. Well, one question, you suggested that Sheikhu made it up. Yeah, did he do such things?
Yes.
Okay. That's because in other cases he could be remarkably honest as well.
No, I'll just answer this point specifically.
Yeah. Go ahead.
The thing with Sheikhu, I mean, it might be that he made it up or the people who were writing him were making it up. That's also possible. The reason why we suspect it is, first of all, we haven't found, that's a weak argument. There's nothing in the poems that the Christian sort of scholars supplied that actually appears in our discovery. That would have been, that would have proved it.
It doesn't appear.
It doesn't appear. So that would, if it had been, that would have proven that it's true because we have, a continuation. And all the Christian versions ends exactly where the Christian, where the Geniza text, the original discovery was made. And it makes no sense that these other manuscripts end exactly where this torn paper ended up. Now, if you would want to defend Sheikho, and this is Guy's role in our discussions, it could be that he received, or he or the people who were writing him, saw the Geniza text and copied their manuscript up to that point. And maybe in Iraq now there are these manuscripts that have the whole poem. You know, had Sheikho sort of published the whole, had Hirschfeld published the whole Geniza text, maybe that would have sort of encouraged the Christian scholars to send the whole manuscript that they had. But you understand the argument?
Yeah.
Sorry.
So the second is, well, the question is also quite straightforward. How does he say the greatest Qibla? How was it in
Al-Qibla al-Uzma.
Uzma.
Al-Uzma, yeah.
Okay. And then, yeah, this is just, so it looks like a soft shulbi. Soft shulbi attitude. And that does, you said it claims superiority. Does it claim superiority?
اختصهم واختارهم, it claims, it doesn't necessarily, but I think that using verbs like اختصهم واختارهم implies superiority, implies choice, right? And just two more things which came to my mind. One is that, as far as I remember, I remember that in Al-Andalus there was an issue with the Christians and the Jews using Arabic, which was not liked necessarily by the Arabs because the monopoly of the language of the dominance. So it is interesting that sometimes this happens. You cannot use our language because that's the language of prestige. And then, well, you said that it's reclaiming the Arabian Jewish history, and well, it seems to me, and you probably, it's obvious for you, but I might be wrong in understanding it, that there is a conscientious forgetting before in general. So you know that in his making our history, there is not just the adding, but also the erasing things which we don't want to. And as as Muhammad and the Jewish encounter didn't end it so well. So yeah.
I mean, obviously, there's much more to say about that than that one paragraph that I said. I think it's a very complicated issue that should be parsed out in terms of period. I wouldn't be surprised at all if in the whole sort of crazy times during the conquests, the Jews who are living in Egypt and in Iraq and Palestine don't know what happened in Arabia because there's all debates about who were these Jews. There are people here who know more about this than me. Who are these Jews? Did they have any contacts with the great centers in Babylonia and Palestine? We can argue what was the state of the center in Palestine. And then there is that sort of question. So it's very probable that people just didn't know about it in the first, second, third centuries. Of course, when you are in the 10th century, 11th century, 12th century, everybody knows the Sirah, and we have accounts of Jewish educated people reading the Sirah. Samawal, this time al-Maghrabi, is the obvious example where he says that he read, and this is what caused him to then, convert. And I'm sure that Maimonides knew very well the Sirah. And in that period, I wouldn't be surprised if it's conscious forgetting. It's also important to remember that in our day, the history of Muhammad and the Jews of Medina takes on a much, much, much greater role. I'm not a modern scholar in Islamic discourse than it did in the Middle Ages. And I can give you a lot of examples for that.
So one thing, just a clarification of the Sema corpus. So is our only access, so you're not, the things that you didn't label as pseudo-Sema, our only access to that diwan is that the Sheikho edition?
I think it's the only edition, right? Sheikho's, I think.
Yeah, and we don't have access to the manuscript behind it. Is it part of like Baghdadi manuscript?
I haven't.
Okay.
You asked about the Baghdadi manuscripts?
Yeah. Is that?
As far as we know, it's only Sheikh's publication.
Okay.
Yeah, in Al-Mashriq.
We have no, I don't know how to go about even searching for them.
It's in the other question I have is, do you know if the original corpus, is it cited in like Jahiz or anything like that? Or do we only know it via Sheikh?
Do you mean stuff
like
the
lines from Samuel?
Lamia?
Yeah.
They're cited in Kitab al-Aghani, for example.
Okay,
yeah, it's good classical Arabic poetry.
Okay, so with that being said, now I can ask my question.
In the Hamasa, of course,
okay,
yes.
Okay,
yeah.
So now I can ask my question without sounding like an idiot. So, okay, so the thing that the corpus that it really reminds me a lot of is Umayyah ibn Abi Salt, because it's a lot of this biblical Quranic material that's pre-Islamic, kind of maybe overlaps a little bit with Muhammad's time and things like that. The thing I think is really interesting about this corpus is I don't personally know of any example where like later Christian communities like took Umayyah ibn Abi Salt's like poetry under their wing and try to expand upon it or something like that.
You don't know?
Yeah, I don't know,
okay.
and so I think this is really interesting. But I wonder where the your non-pseudo material actually comes from, and it might come from this kind of Abbasid area where people like Adi ibn Zayd al-Ibadi and Umayyah ibn Abi. So there's a lot of this material that's supposedly pre-Islamic, but it's very Quranic in its idiom. And even someone like Jahiz like points it out as being like, this is shady stuff, so watch out from it. I wonder if that material comes from that Arab circle, and then it's later on adapted by, basically the Jewish community.
No, it's a fair question. We haven't checked the transmission of Samawal's Diwan, actual transmission. It would be interesting to look into it. But it's a general problem that doesn't only relate to Samawal, but to many other Jahili poets. So yeah, but it's a good point. We'll look it up. Thank you.
Okay, in that case, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.